Well, I think we might begin our fourth and last major event of the conference, our conference Order with or Without Law. Welcome to those who are new to the conference events, and thank you again to those who have attended some others. We're very pleased to have faculty, students, attorneys, local attorneys, and other friends here. I'm Robert Spoo, Chapman Professor of Law and Associate Dean for Faculty Development. I am especially keenly interested in this conference and really put it together on the basis of our Chapman Trust funds, and we are grateful for those, and to Greg Ray and Sharon Bell for making available these opportunities to bring wonderful events and conferences to the university. I'm going to let my colleague, Professor Randy Fuller, introduce us, but let me just very briefly introduce him. Randy is Chapman Professor of English and has been with the University of Tulsa for two years, and is a terrific 19th-century Americanist scholar of literature. So he seemed like a very appropriate person to introduce this panel. I know that our co-panelists know him and his work. And I should also say, and this is, there's a certain element of what we're going to be talking about, publishing in the American publishing in the 19th century and trade courtesy. There's a certain element of unaccountable generosity that may or may not exist alongside the rational incentives for what they did. Let me say that Randy Fuller is currently enjoying a Guggenheim, but he has also agreed at the very same time to serve as chair of English. So that seems to me to be the sort of extraordinary courtesy that maybe we'll be talking about a bit. So Randy, let me introduce you.
Trade courtesy or dupe? Thanks, Bob, and it's really my pleasure to be here. I'm Randy Fuller. I'm in the English department. I don't normally get invited into the inner precincts of the law school, so I appreciate being here. And I would just say I'm very excited about this particular panel. I think you're in for a real treat with our guest today. I'm going to go alphabetical here with my introductions. Michael Everton is the Associate Professor in the Department of English at Simon Fraser University, and he focuses on American literature before 1900 and the history of the book, especially, as you're going to find out, I think, in his talk today, the business of literature. He's the author of a wonderful book, which I highly recommend, called The Grand Chorus of Complaint, published by Oxford University Press a couple of years ago. And that looks at the relationships between authors and publishers from the Revolutionary period to roughly the Civil War. His new book project is A History of American Trade Courtesy, and he has held research fellowships at the Huntington Library, the American Antiquarian Society, and many others. Meredith McGill, to my immediate left, is Associate Professor of English at Rutgers University, as well as the Director of the Rutgers Digital Humanities Initiative. There's a lot of points of contact between that and other members of our English department, actually. She's the author of a really wonderful book, American Literature and the Culture of Reprinting, 1837 to 1853. And she's also edited two collections of essays, Taking Liberties with the Author, which came out last year, and The Traffic in Poems, 19th-Century Poetry and Transatlantic Exchange, which came out in 2008. Currently, she is completing a study of poetry and mass culture in antebellum America. And finally, I don't know if Bob has been formally introduced to this group, but Bob is the Chapman Distinguished Chair in law, as well as the Dean of Faculty Development here in the law school at TU. He has a whole string of interesting and diverse experiences in his quiver, including being the editor of James Joyce Quarterly once upon a time, serving as law clerk for the Honorable Sonia Sotomayor, who was here earlier this semester, and representing a cornucopia of authors and artists and filmmakers and others. He's published a number of books, but the one most recently, and the one that I would call your attention to, is called Without Copyrights: Piracy, Publishing, and Public Domain, and it was published by Oxford in 2013. So it's my great privilege to welcome this group, and I look forward to hearing what they have to say. Thank you.
So, as the first representative of the humanities to stand behind the podium these 2 days, I'm worried that you guys are thinking, oh my God, this is how they do things. They do little doodles. It's not quite that bad. I want to repeat the chorus of thanks to Bob and Barbette and all the staff and everyone involved in putting together these wonderful 2 days, and as well to the Chapman Trust for the funding. It's really been a pleasure to be here and to speak to an entirely different audience. It's been nice too, because I was a little worried that I've been teaching the Scarlet Letter course, and that we would be branded, Meredith and I, with Scarlet H's for humanities. It hasn't quite happened like that, although at the end of my talk, maybe you might want to. So a little bit about project history before I go on the clock. Cal and Chris were talking about the forever thing of artists complaining about compensation. And that was what my book a few years ago was about, The Grand Chorus of Complaint. It was about author-publisher relations and a lot of gossipy complaining. The research I'm talking about here was to have been the second chapter in that book, and a lot of you have probably experienced this. It started as a chapter, actually it started as part of a chapter, and then it grew to a chapter, and then it grew to a couple chapters, and then I was like, oh God, this is a book. So it is now eventually going to be a book. The problem with it being a book, as Bob knows well because he's been supporting me, trying to find funding for this, is it takes a lot of money because the research it's based on is manuscript. It's all archival. And the archives are everywhere in North America, and they are in much of Western Europe. So I need more money to get there. I've been doing this now for years. I'm still probably just a quarter of the way through. So part of my reason for mentioning that to you right now is that this is very much research in progress. So if you think of this like a meal, I don't even have all the ingredients yet on the counter. I'm getting there. But what I want to do is talk about a couple of big ideas from the research that grows out of my book a couple years ago on the kind of moral discourse. I would say governed, but the moral discourse that was a fundamental part of 19th century literary business, which is the business of literary publishing. Okay. So the image up there comes from an 1891 letter to Robert Underwood Johnson, secretary to the American Copyright League. The League had just shepherded through Congress the first international copyright legislation in the U.S., and thus, according to this very authoritative doodle, restored the natural rights of writers over the greed of publishers. For his efforts, Johnson was awarded the Legion of Honor from France. So maybe there really is something to this, the Liberty Doodle. But of course, there's a lot of activity behind the scenes. Somebody really involved in the push for international copyright was a publisher named George Haven Putnam, the son of the grand godfather, one of the godfathers of American publishing, George Palmer Putnam. It was Putnam's duty to compel politicians, a lot of letter writing. And one of his letters is an 1890 letter that hit all the right buttons. It's less moralistic, more politically savvy than previous lobbying attempts. In it, he said to Secretary Johnson in a letter he wrote to him in 1890, he'd sent the letter to 237 booksellers around the country. Not the entire country, though. He said he didn't send them to Texas because people in Texas were too stupid to get the point. There are any Texans in the room, by the way, don't feel too bad, because he also excluded pretty much the entire South. We were also too stupid. I'm from Virginia, so I'm right there with you. I have a point in starting with this other than currying favor with the home team. In his letter, Putnam badmouthed quasi-copyright system publishers long relied on to organize the international book trade in the absence of international copyright. Here are the basics of it. Bob's probably going to go into a lot more detail about this. The basics as explained to a British writer by the Philadelphia firm J.B. Lippincott and Co. Like most writers, this writer labored under a, quote, misapprehension of the IP situation. Quote, explaining it to the writer, a copyright protection cannot under any circumstances be obtained in this country for works that are not produced by an American author. A mutual agreement exists among leading publishers here by which they are pledged not to interfere with the rights of any house purchasing advance sheets of an English work, but it is an agreement which depends upon courtesy only and has no legal sanction to enforce it. This was the original conception of trade courtesy, which was essentially that the first firm to publicly declare an intent to publish a foreign book had a monopoly right to that book. If another publisher announced or jumped a claim, or announced an intention to jump a claim, he was warned off by the quote owner, and if the rival actually went through with the threat and refused to cough up all or some of the profits to the owner, which happened a lot, then the owner could resort to a number of accepted reprisals. The owner might reduce the price of his own edition, or better yet, reprint one of the rival's other books, which happened a fair bit. Eye for an eye, book for a book. By the 1850s, the custom was expanded. The most far-reaching change was the formalization of reciprocal agreements between U.S. publishing houses and foreign firms or writers that gave U.S. firms, quote, exclusive rights to publish a given title or a given writer in exchange for payment. Usually the payment was fairly small, but as American firms became better capitalized in the 1850s and the 1870s in particular, they began to pay British authors pretty handsome sums. The baseline was £10, but it could go up much, much higher, and not just for people like Dickens. In this way, American publishers could speak of having recognized rights to foreign texts over which technically they had no legal claim. The system went by different names. These are all quotes from letters. The laws of honor, good faith, the etiquette of the trade, which is my personal favorite, but it was usually called the courtesy of the trade, or courtesy for short. Putnam, however, called it, quote, the present general scramble system, or rather lack of system, in the reprinting of foreign books, and bemoaned its perceived ineffectiveness. Over the previous 2 decades, Putnam's views had become more common. A precursor to the ACL argued that there were no viable rights outside the law. At an 1870s British Royal Commission on Copyright, one American publisher, Farrar, said, quote, I do not believe that any voluntary association of publishers to maintain copyright among themselves can ever be lasting. What likely goaded courtesy norm publishers was Putnam's declaration that only copyright could exist on the, quote, broader grounds of justice. A self-described function of courtesy was to do justice to rival publishers and foreign writers. For one of its main architects, in fact, it was justice based only on the rules that govern gentlemen. That's a quote, as you'll see the excerpt of the letter up there. This is Henry Charles Carey. One naysayer who said the courtesy was a necessary evil said it was best understood as a placeholder for law, the evolution of a principle. Quote, before the reign of laws established in any province of human affairs, we see men feeling their way to it, endeavoring to reduce the chaos of conflicting claims to some kind of rule. No, I know I'm going back and forth here, but I'm trying to give you a sense of the argument. No, said early courtesy publishers, the norm worked without need of what Herman Melville called law's, quote, civil charm. Its rights were indeed artificial, as you'll see Lippincott say here in this letter, created by the industry itself, but that didn't mean they weren't recognized industry-wide, in much of the industry, as rights. And to a remarkable extent, they were. There was a coherent system built up around these rights, complete with receipts for unauthorized reprinting, here, official export offers, this one to Roberts Brothers in Boston, narrative agreements, and contracts, which is particularly interesting to me. Plus, as Bob explains in great detail, a complex array of sanctions. In all, it's true that courtesy had begun to unravel by 1891, but for most of the century, it more or less made good on publisher Henry Holt's claim that it was self-regulation without law, and that's his famous quote about this. Just wrapping up my sort of intro tennis match. Critics saw it differently. In 1867, the Atlantic Monthly, skeptical that there could be any compelling rights outside the law, called it the most exquisitely organized system of piracy. So it was beautiful, but it was piracy. William Gilmore Simms, the novelist and editor of South Carolina, argued that, quote, "To be hated, it but needs to be seen. Being a moral pirate doesn't make you any less a pirate." In his Devil's Dictionary, that was the eventual title. The original was called The Cynic's Word Book. Ambrose Bierce, who is eminently quotable, defined piracy as, quote, "commerce without its folly swaddles, just as God made it." Courtesy norm was just so many swaddles. It's not easy to reconstruct the swaddles of this non-system system. And Catherine, you were talking yesterday about metaphors. I am always grasping for metaphors. And in one talk at my own university, I refer to it as dark energy. It's hard to see if you don't know what you're looking for, and you have to do all these kind of complex experiments to put your finger on it. But my favorite one that I've come up with is going to need a bigger boat. Because when you actually see trade courtesy and you learn to see it, it's everywhere. And it's that moment, right, where Roy Scheider says, "Oh my God, what are we doing? Like, we need a much bigger boat to do trade courtesy." Before Bob's book, most scholarly treatments relied on the low-hanging fruit of a few sources that were not without their problems. And I'm very interested in methodology. I'm not going to talk about it here much, but it might be something we talk about in Q&A. But to reconstruct the courtesy norm from the ground up means getting your hands dirty in the archive, very, very dirty in the archive. You don't just walk into an archive and look up courtesy of the trade in a finding aid. It's not a subject heading in catalogs or databases. Bob, your book, without copyright, is subject headed copyright, not trade courtesy. If I seem a bit jittery about all this, it's because I've spent the last few years making an as exhaustive and empirical study of courtesy as possible based on archival sources, a process that is occasionally maddening given the fragmentary state of most publishers' archives. At the moment, my database consists of mountains of disarticulated data, which is why I feel at times as though I'm tilting at windmills. I was having a cozy little anxiety attack in the summer of 2011 when a mutual acquaintance put me in touch with Bob, who kindly sent me the draft of his first chapter, Taxonomy of 19th Century Trade Courtesy, which finally reached beyond the low-hanging fruit that everyone had been relying on. When I read it, the angels sang. It was an amazing moment. Reading his account of trade courtesy in that first chapter, what struck me first was how elegant it was. Not the writing, actually it was awesome, I'm just joking, but the system itself. Suddenly trade courtesy made so much sense. Here was the elegant universe of extra-legal IP. Here was the system that Henry Holt was so philosophical about. No wonder courtesy publishers took it as an articulation of a moral system. It really was something to believe in, and many of them did. If we'd forgotten that moral philosophy gave birth to economics, a number of scholars are trying to remind us. A flurry of work by historians, literary scholars, economists, and sociologists takes seriously the ethical beliefs behind economic life and business. This work resonates with my own quixotic attempt, crusade maybe, to tell the history of trade courtesy from the ground up. Because, as surprising as it sounds, to read through publishers' archives is to enter a world of moral abstraction. I know it's kind of shocking. What I've been doing, and what I want to spend the remainder of my time doing here, is to talk about that abstraction in the context of 19th century attitudes toward what we might think of as moral and immoral norms. Bob has noted that, quote, trade courtesy was good business as well as good manners. And what I'm interested in is the subordinate rather than coordinate relationship between those two clauses. I want to do so, by the way, without the scare quotes around words like good and bad, because most 19th century Americans didn't put scare quotes around them, including business people, and that's really important to remember. My pivot between good and bad will be the self-consciously paradoxical expression frequently applied to the courtesy norm, then, and interesting in a lot of legal scholarship now. You see this phrase used more by legal scholars talking about trade courtesy than literary scholars or historians. Honor among thieves. I'll let Henry Holt, the best theorist of the norm in his time, explain what he called the paradox. At one end, its principal material was not protected by law, and the business lived to a large extent on what was morally, if not legally, thievery. while at the other end, there was honor among thieves. If, in their respect, they paid each other's property. In a nutshell, courtesy publishers, recognizing their compromised moral position, tried to make the best of it by harmonizing these two flags. And by the way, that work, this idea builds on Meredith's work in her 2003 book, which talked about reprinting as a Republican process, a small R Republican process. And I won't steal any thunder. In July 1875, J.B. Lippincott opened an office at 10 Henrietta Street, Covent Garden, London. The goal, facilitate the flow of print moving between London and Philadelphia, the firm's home base. Philly needed boots on the ground, that's their quote. And its man in London, Joseph Garmison, knew the business of British publishing, but it turns out not so much the norms of transatlantic publishing. At least twice in the first 5 months, the Home Office had to explain in 5-page letters the courtesy norm. Garmison either had difficulty understanding it or he had difficulty creating the kind of network that he was going to need to fulfill what Lippincott wanted from him. And this gives you an example, by the way. This is Henry Carey's list of agents, many of which are in Europe, in 1835. And now we're talking about the 1870s. They needed Garmison to make up for lost time. To make a long correspondence short, Garmison's leisurely pace drove Philadelphia batty. We would suggest you make arrangements with the leading publishers of novels to send you early sheets of what they deem good works. This is all nuts and bolts trade courtesy stuff, but they had to explain it in incredible detail. My literature colleagues are obsessed with knowing how much writers were paid, but courtesy meant more than money. It meant networking, and networking meant reciprocation, and reciprocation meant mannered behavior. Actually, I'm going to skip part of that. I think I'll come back to that point. The Lippincott papers, 140 linear feet consisting of some 94 boxes, many bound volumes like the one you see there. And by the way, that volume is about that big and about that thick. And thousands of files have barely been mined. This is at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. In fact, they barely been cataloged. They just became available about 10 years ago. And some are in such bad shape from water damage, which is frequent in publishers' archives because of all the fires in publishing houses, that you could actually bend books like this almost to the breaking point. Unbelievable. But they're a gold mine of potential. They've got gold mine potential for anyone interested in how courtesy was practiced day to day by boots on the ground, especially because of letters like the ones above. I'm not too proud to admit I was giddy when I saw these letters to Garmison, and I have to explain why. Such letters within publishing firms are extraordinarily rare. What you tend to find are letters explaining trade courtesy to writers, obviously foreign writers, American writers who were annoyed, and when they're mad, other publishers. But an intra-firm letter, I thought, now I'm going to get the dirt. I'm going to see what they really thought. This is where they don't have to pretend anymore. This is the skeptic in me. They were going to say that the norm really was, as one later pirate said, monopoly posing as piety. And this is what a lot of people thought about Henry Carey, by the way, one of the original architects. One critic later in the century called him the, quote, apostle of protection and freebooting. There were no secrets to be had in these letters. Unfortunately, my giddiness sank to despair. I saw my project flying out the window. Maybe, though, that's what's unremarkable about the letter is what's important about all the letters. Trade courtesy was probably not a cartel. There were no secret committees controlling the fates and fortunes of authors and domestic publishers. Cooperation, yes. Coordination, yes. Monopoly, yeah, but probably because of a trade courtesy bad boy called Harper & Brothers in New York. So you'll tell me about them in a minute. What about the other side of courtesy, the so-called ethics? Equity, honor, yeah, actually, probably. I've been surprised at how often a publisher would surrender a sure thing, not just out of fear for reprisal, but because he hadn't abided the principle. Because doing so would be wrong, or in their terms, discourteous. I don't have statistical data to back this up yet. I have a lot of numbers to crunch. And as Bob politely suggested to me, maybe you should hire someone to help you crunch these numbers, knowing my place in an English department. But the anecdotal data is copious, even after the 1870s, which is very interesting, because that's when most people think it goes out the window, which Bob has corrected too. A Kentucky newspaper publisher once complained that, quote, literary men have a fad for theory and what they call moral principle. Absolutely. For a long time, literary critics and historians dismissed talk of morality and ethics out of hand. But justice and courtesy did mean something to publishers, and at the moment I'm trying to identify patterns of usage in the correspondence of the major publishers. This work has become easier to theorize with recent work by sociologists, especially Gabriel Abend. I don't even know if that's how you pronounce his name, who just published a book on this, on what he calls the moral background of business ethics in America. His book asks us to consider what's behind first-order moral claims in business settings. What was their moral background? That's his phrase. That background is made up of concepts and beliefs that give the first-order moral claims their meaning and their force, often through appeals to shared values. So what was the particular repertoire of concepts, his phrase, behind the courtesy claim? Where does it come from? There are various ways of finding out. One is to look for patterns of usage in the writings of tradespeople. That's something I'm going to need to do once I have data, or cohesive data. Another is to source terms by looking at widely read texts from the era, political economy textbooks, business handbooks, and they're fascinating, conduct books, sermons, and other theological writings. In these texts, terms such as courtesy and its analogs are used with surprising consistency. For example, a Baptist sermon stresses the importance of common civilities, including, and this is the sermonizer's language, putting the most favorable construction upon the conduct of others, however peculiar their opinions. Courtesy is essentially withholding judgment, in part to promote welfare and happiness via cooperation. Meredith and I were just saying at the close of the plenary, of the keynote, that rarely have we heard the term social welfare used so much at a conference, but you see it here. It's sympathy with the position, even in the absence of empathy. Jurist Francis Lieber, who's an interesting name incidentally, since he's the one that wrote the Lieber Code, which was the justification for total war in the Civil War, a kind of norm unto itself, a very consequential norm. Lieber had the ear of a few writers and publishers, and his 1839 political economy text married the scientific but sentimental approach to ethics of people like Francis Wayland and the business text sitting on the shelves of these publishers. And he elaborated on the social morality implicit in the Baptist writers' tract. For Lieber, human beings are unique in the animal world in their sense of responsibility, a concept that speaks to 19th century definitions of courtesy. Courtesy was, in his words, fellow feeling. But here's the rub. Not everybody had fellow feeling. There were haves and have-nots. If you had it, you were conscious of it. If you didn't have it, you had just as little chance of understanding it as a blind person would have of understanding what a color is. And that's his analogy. Good exists because good people are conscious of their goodness. It's very tautological. Just as fellow feeling, courtesy exists because people are conscious of experiencing sympathy. As in the science of morality, as in religion, said the era, so in trade. So morality, religion, trade. In fact, more so in trade. There was a sense in the 19th century that tradespeople were even more ethical than the average person because they had survived the fire of the furnace in New York. And they'd come out, and their character was not just intact, but glowing. Courtesy publishers had fellow feeling. Courtesy publishing wasn't just about regulating competition to create conditions suitable to profit. It was that, but not just that. It was about the welfare of the individual soul, a word business writers used without blushing, and about the moral and economic welfare of the United States. The norm of courtesy was, one minister said, a question of politics, of economy, and of national courtesy. Most courtesy publishers like the word courtesy, some good faith, others rules. Lippincott liked etiquette. Ambrose Bierce had a tidy definition for etiquette, a code of social rites, ceremonies, and observances constituting a vulgarian's claim to toleration. I love Bierce. The Devil's Dictionary is so fantastic. It should always be sitting on your desk. In other words, And this is my point here today, really. The problem with the courtesy norm was that it was a norm in the first place. The very completeness and elegance of courtesy were simply evidence of its corruption. In the words of one critic, this is a quote, this is a kind of long quote, mutual appropriations and reciprocal forays reduce the otherwise gentlemanly pursuit of publishing to the level of the most questionable speculations. Courtesy must make these guys, he said, blush for their profession. Technical honesty is what the 19th century called this kind of ethical thinking. Even ministers moved in on the courtesy bashing in the 70s and 80s, largely because from the outside it looked bad. Quote, one of the curious features of all customary morality, one social gospel leader said, is its development in great perfection, the virtues absolutely necessary to the relationships concerned, so publishing. While in other, no less ethical, but only less essential matters, poverty, say, there is no corresponding moral life. There is honor among thieves, for though they may steal from the public, they must in self-defense respect each other's rights. Having the ethical rationale of a central component of your business practice characterized as honor among thieves was bad. But to have it used as an epithet for your trade was even worse. It bestowed unwelcome bedfellows. The phrase was more often than not used as shorthand for ostensibly moral norms organizing definitely immoral economies. It was used, for example, to describe the codes of conduct governing party agents who turned out voters for political parties. Their codes weren't as formalized as trade courtesy, and they were definitely never mistaken as Victorian gentlemen. But the norm they followed was characterized as a norm. Then there was slavery. Black codes were an elaborate system of rights and sanctions constituting antebellum American slave culture. One of the most famous was the custom that held that slaveholders maybe shouldn't kill their slaves, even if they could by law, say out of, quote, self-defense. Owners who did were rendered infamous, one account said, because of the damage it did to the reputation of the culture as a whole. The most famous attack on the logic of slavers, though, was leveled by Thoreau in response to the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law and Massachusetts' timid technical opposition to it. It's pretty obvious what's going on, he noted, when people suggest that, quote, there is less honor among thieves than was supposed, instead of just acknowledging, quote, the fact they are thieves. The norms of the slave trade, as Stowe wrote in Uncle Tom's Cabin, debauched and depraved the slaver until he, quote, feels no shame in it. In questioning how a slaver's inhuman actions could somehow constitute the honorable part of a lawful trade, Stowe relies on the same logic that critics of courtesy relied on when they asked how it was that a moral norm made an immoral trade any less immoral. Stowe, Emerson, Thoreau, Frederick Douglass, John Greenleaf Whittier, all were preaching the same message actual preachers preached about technical honesty. As one minister said, we were trying to, quote, prevent men from persuading themselves that wrong actions are not wrong. Or as Thoreau lectured, policy is not morality. By the late 1870s and 80s, though courtesy norm publishers stuck to their guns as much as they could, the balance of power had swung to those who reveled in being thieves, without honor. Meanwhile, advocates of international copyright tired of both camps. I'm going to reduce a long quote to a bit of a quip, which basically said, you're both wrong and you're both right. But, and here's the quote, where the whole moral basis is false, to apportion justly the shares of right and wrong might prove no easy matter. It was around this time, with the heyday of courtesy as a moral norm clearly in the rearview mirror, that Henry Holt began memorializing it. I find the timing interesting. Stamping it as a moral norm, which is how people would remember it later. Here he is at Yale. Sorry, you're not seeing that, I am. Here he is at Yale in 1888, his alma mater. Through self-interest backed up by considerable clear insight and not a little openness of spirit, note the moralistic language, there gradually grew up quite a code of custom, which was a primitive makeshift for legislation. Holt did believe it was kind of teleological process that copyright would come out of it. But earlier courtesy publishers did not believe that, people like Carey. The old trade courtesy depended on the voluntary and informal consensus of a small body of men, exceptional in being constant contact with letters. It was an unstable equilibrium, he said. And then I love this language. The miracle is not so much this established houses and a few other people wanting to be established respected each other's rights mutually conceded, and that no newcomer should attack the salutary monopolies those houses had helped each other build. The idea of salutary monopolies 2 years before the Sherman Antitrust Act once again puts the norm in bed with some not so great bedfellows. But Holt believed that, having been handed lemons, publishers had made lemonade. Good lemonade. Lemonade that, quote, filtered and fibered the blood, as Whitman might say. I'm going to conclude with an example that's going to muck up all my suggestions that there are any real ethical values behind words like courtesy and etiquette. I'm not even going to read this to you, I'm just going to show you. And had we not seen the Sarah Silverman clip, I would have given you a trigger warning, but this is going to be nothing compared to what you saw. But normally when I show this, people are aghast. So if you're bothered by language, yeah, you might want to look down at your notes for a sec. This is Lafcadio Hearn writing to Harper and Brothers in what I think is probably 1890. And Hearn is not actually really involved in trade credits. He's an American citizen. But it gives you a sense of the vitriol felt about this firm, not just by Hearn, but about pretty much everybody. The business practices of Harper's gave credence to every nasty thing ever said about the courtesy norm. It's like they were commercial psychopaths. The business practices of no one wanted to cross them as here. Publish on them means reprint something they had claimed. You just never knew when they were going to go off. Harper's was a courtesy norm firm. But to borrow and bend a quip from Kwame Appiah, its partners never confused the job description of the publisher with that of the moral theorist. The firm was unapologetically uninterested in anything but profit, and as everyone they did business with came to know, they abused courtesy whenever they needed to for roughly 70 years. This is Carey basically saying, when you need to follow it, you do. When you don't, you don't, and then later you come back to it. What the hell? For this reason, he told Harper's, Carey would no longer, quote, argue or discuss abstract rights or principles with the firm, since it seemed these rights somehow always favored the New York house. Lippincott could have written the same thing in the 1870s. In fact, he did. He just wasn't really willing to give it to Harper's on the chin. But he did say some nasty things, at one point telling them in a letter that they were trying to shake the whole system to its advantage. Harper seemed to prove that courtesy was not courteous, or maybe Harper's was the exception that proved the moral norm. I don't know. I haven't figured it out yet. In conclusion, I'm editing a new edition of, I'm working on an edition of Billy Budd, Melville's Billy Budd, Melville's final consequential account of human life under human law. In the book, Melville famously describes the way Iago-like immorality is invariably dominated, in his words, by intellectuality. Civilization is auspicious to it. Immorality or evil folds itself in the mantle of respectability. The quote's not a perfect match, of course, and I don't mean it to be. I'm not saying that Melville was writing about trade courtesy, although he hated Harper's maybe more than he hated any firm in the world. It's just interesting in the context of Henry Holt, who kind of unintentionally became the hero of my paper as I was revising it. I used to get frustrated with Holt because he would say things like, oh, all those old publishers, Carey and Harper's and Scribner's and Putnam, they were too good for petty rivalry. They didn't go after one another the way these young people do today. Not quite so much. Like, there was arson, there was industrial espionage. Like, what are you thinking? He knew this was not true, but I don't think it was a lie. I think it was an aspirational statement. He knew that firms like Harper's cloaked themselves in the mantle of civility. But for him, not even Harper's could upset the ideal. Or maybe Holt's the anti-hero, because what Melville's suggesting is that in America, what he calls the lame ducks of morality hide in nice suits and in plain sight. Maybe the civilized publishers were the problem. Thank you.
There we go.
Yeah.
How do we, Great. Okay. Terrific. I'll join the grand chorus of thanks. It's really been a wonderful couple of days. I have to admit that I didn't realize when I came here that I was a legal peripheralist amongst legal peripheralists. So you'll find my comments in some ways maybe directed at an audience that's not gathered here, which is to say I was interested in convincing scholars who overestimate the importance of copyright law to the protection of intellectual property in the 19th century that it wasn't so important, or and you know, I'm going to be echoing a lot of what we've been hearing about the other ways in which text circulated and culture was produced and reproduced. But I am thinking always about literary scholars who I think often misapprehend the law, treating the passage of statutes as reliable benchmarks of cultural change, and they look at legal treatises that strive to pull the messiness of the law together as somehow instantly transforming actual practices. That's a caricature, but I think it's more true than not. When thinking about what lawyers might need to know, I wondered whether lawyers conversely misapprehend the history of print, thinking of all markets for culture as mass markets, and imagining print to be one thing. If so, I hope the slides that I'll show you here will convince you otherwise. Right, so if literary critics tend to assume the law is more coherent than it is, do legal scholars assume textual production is more uniform, more generalizable than a book historian knows it to be? My slides aren't going to be into the very last one, has some text on it, so mostly I'm going to show you what book historians sometimes call material texts, pictures of 19th century print, so you can get a sense of how it differed from itself. But I also want to think about Chris and Cal's description of the negative space of IP, and see if we could imagine history as reversing that presumption. What if you lived in a world where very few cultural products were copyrighted, where the norm of circulation of print, the most popularly printed material was not copyrighted? And I'm thinking here of periodicals and newspapers, which by custom and not by law weren't copyrighted. And then I'll talk some more about performance texts, the complicated relationship of changes in theatrical practice to proper performance rights in printed play texts. So that's where I'll be headed today. In my talk this afternoon, I want to use the concept of playwright, that seems to be misspelled, but it's not, an outmoded term that refers to the protection of performance rights in printed and unprinted dramatic compositions. I want to use playwright to ask questions about how we tell the history of copyright. What might it mean to take cultural practices as seriously as statutory and case law when thinking about the history of intellectual property? Is it possible to write a history of copyright that doesn't take the current system as its telos or norm, measuring history as deviant or an immature form of cultural circulation that will land us where we are today? Playwright, written with an R but no W, is an awkward word. Indeed, it's difficult to hear the difference between it and the name we use for the author of a dramatic text. Eaton S. Drone, one of my favorite late 19th century systematizers of American law, he thought the term would clarify the difference between the right to multiply copies of a printed text, and I'm quoting Drone here, and the sole liberty of publicly performing a dramatic composition, rights that he understood to be wholly distinct in nature, right? So he's arguing for playwright to disaggregate performance rights in printed and unprinted text from statutory copyright and common law copyright. Drone's term is useful to me, however, because of its antiquarianism. It names a once important, or at least promising, legal and cultural distinction that we no longer find pertinent. Historians of American copyright tend to think, or I'd say literary historians maybe, tend to think that the problem of playwright was solved in 1856 when the statute was revised to extend copyright to encompass performance rights for dramatic compositions, marking the beginning of the transformation of a law understood as a trade privilege, that is, merely the publisher's right to the copy, into something like the bundle of rights, including rights held in reserve that we are familiar with today. Indeed, Oren Bracha has identified the 1856 law as a crucial stage in the century-long process of abstraction, whereby a limited right to reprint copies is transformed into a form of property that entitled the owner to, and I'm quoting Bracha here, to profit from the exploitation of the work irrespective of changes of form and medium. While I agree entirely with the trajectory of Bracha's historical narrative, I'm interested by contrast in how long it took after this law's passage for it to confer a property right that held value for the theatrical community. So we've got law and that nobody's using, which I find really provocative and interesting. In its untimeliness and its stubborn refusal to be folded into copyright proper, Playwright names for me three critical principles that I hope can help us resist the pull of a teleological copyright history. That is, one in which we are destined to arrive at a system in which copyright is infinitely extensible and an abstract right. Our world, governed by a consensus, or mostly a consensus, that intellectual property rights are best regulated through the figure of the author. That figure of the author wasn't always the figure through which text circulated or property was thought to be held. The very existence of Playwright reminds us of the specificity of 19th century copyright. Rather than a bundle of rights, it's a law that covers some texts and not others, and only by fits and starts gets extended to a range of textual and non-textual objects before being recast in 1909 to cover, quote, the writings of an author. That's the first time that the word author enters the statute. The word author enters the statutes, but the definition of the object of property as the writings of an author is 1909. So let me just remind you, it really takes the whole century. The 1790 Act protected maps, charts, and books. It slowly got amended to include historical and other prints. I love that. There might be things that would be of value that aren't historical. We'll wait and see. In 1831, it covered musical compositions. In 1856, performance rights in plays. In 1865, photographs and negatives. In 1870, paintings, drawings, chromolithographs, statuary, and other works of the fine arts. It took till 1870 for dramatization rights to be added, right? Performance rights are separate from dramatization. And also translation rights, right? Property and translation doesn't come to the 1870. In 1882, decorative tiles, plaques, and pottery were added with a specification. I was thinking about this in Catherine Fisk's talk about the problem of stamping the copyright notice on statuary and decorative tiles, the question of the mark of the signature, where it was going to go. It has an elaborate provision for that. So most of the century it takes to keep adding, the process is to add different objects to which copyright might be extended. But the assumption isn't that it would include them. The concept of playwright and the eruption into the legal system in the 1870s and 80s of numerous disputes about property in theatrical performances also points to the many forms of regulation of intellectual property outside of the copyright system in the 19th century, and demonstrates the productive misalignment of national legal systems and the transnational circulation of culture. And I think this is really important, especially for people working in American culture. We tend to think nationally, we think about national law, but the 19th century was a great period of the transnational circulation of culture. One of the problems with literary historians' turn to statutory and case law as benchmarks of social and cultural change is their failure to capture the dynamic interplay between the territorial limits of 19th century copyright law and transnational cultural circuits, of which drama is a prime example, a very profitable example. What I'm aiming for in my thinking and writing on this topic is a copyright history that would take cultural practices as seriously as statutory and case law, one that would identify multiple ways in which innovation thrives at the limits of the law. So I'm going to go back and review some material I covered in my book. So for those of you who have read parts of it, bear with me. American copyright has been marked from the start by a kind of untimeliness, as well as a consequential unevenness in the distribution of property rights in printed texts. As I've argued at greater length elsewhere, and let's see if I can advance the slide, and it works. The 1790 Copyright Act gave authors and publishers a national monopoly on particular properties far in advance of a development of a national market for books. That's the sort of asymmetry. You've got a federal right, but no national markets over which to exercise it yet. So this is, I think, the generative irony of antebellum literary production. Regional markets, book markets, only managed to be coordinated into a national book trade system in the mid-1850s, when the nation, ironically, is on the brink of dissolution, right? Just when you've got a national book trade system, you've got serious skepticism about the coherence of the nation in and around disputes over slavery. Structurally speaking, where the distribution of printed text is a challenge, the right to control distribution by limiting copying is a right of questionable value. If you're having trouble getting the book, limiting copying isn't going to be valuable. Unlike in Great Britain, where copyright law helped to regulate a highly organized and centralized book trade, in the United States, authors and proprietors had to contend both with the difficulty of book distribution in a developing nation and with the revolutionary legacy of a cultural and political emphasis on the unrestrained circulation of print. The same law that granted copyright to citizens and residents denied such rights to foreign authors, bestowing on American publishers an extraordinary license, that of the unrestricted republication of foreign texts. The value of copyright in the early republic, then, was diminished by the great demand for the kinds of texts that could be freely reprinted. And this category included cheap print, such as newspapers and periodicals, which were considered outside of the copyright system by custom and by law, and many of the most valuable properties, so cheap print, but also really valuable stuff. The cultural legacy of Europe, as well as the latest British novels, right? So the latest Scott novels had a kind of currency that was valuable, but also high cultural text. Spencer gets reprinted, right? The fruits of Europeans' writing are also open to all printers, technically speaking. Although historians and critics have long regarded the emergence of authors' rights as a threshold condition for a mass market for books, the strengthening of copyright laws was not, I think, I hope some of us have proved this, we'll see, but I don't think the strengthening of the copyright laws was a significant catalyst for growth in the American book industry. Rather, 19th century markets tended to flourish, at times in cutthroat fashion, precisely where the law stopped short of protecting authors' rights. For most of the 19th century, appeals for the regulation of the book trade through universal respect for authors' rights, that's the constant cry of international copyright advocates, these arguments were no match for the realities of a decentralized literary marketplace. That is, the difficulty of transporting printed matter between and among scattered cultural centers, the new nation's appetite for high cultural works in mass cultural formats, and the profits to be made in an uncertain, expanding market by publishing works that had already proved popular with readers, right? American printers just had to look at what was selling in Europe. They didn't have to field test, take the risk on an American property and see if it would sell. I should say also that American critical journals were very key to the reception of British and European works in the British press. I'll show you some examples of the reprinting of British journals whole cloth, which is to say the field testing, they were very aware both of the field testing and of the works themselves, the value of the works themselves. So I think what we have in antebellum American culture is something I'm very interested in, a provincial culture. You can have political independence, of course, without cultural independence. And I don't use provincial, you'll see, I don't think it's a negative. I think it's a mode of literary culture that's yet to be really richly described, at least in the U.S. While supporters of an international copyright law cheaply sought to bring order to the transatlantic book trade, I think this is an important distinction, opponents of the law defended the system of cheap reprinting as a whole. That is, they defended newspapers, magazines, and pamphlets, those publishers, as well as books. Reprinting occurred across a variety of formats. Poetry and tales that were first published in expensively bound gift books reappeared as filler in local newspapers. Entire novels were closely printed in double-column pages and sold for as little as 12.5 cents, and elite British magazines were reprinted in their entirety, but they were also mined for essays that were reassembled into regionally published eclectic magazines. And I'll give you some examples of these. I'll just run through some slides. This is the example of this is a tendentious choice, but Charles Dickens' American Notes, his report on his 1842 tour of the U.S. was published in 3 volumes by his London publishers. Look at all the white space there. 3 volumes, it cost a guinea, which is about $5. Yeah, there's the white space. It was published by multiple rival, in pamphlet forms, by rival firms in the U.S., up and down in New York and Philadelphia. And that's what it looked like when it's published in the U.S., right? That's how you can sell it for 12.5 cents. American publishers were the first, I think, to realize that with this, if you published great numbers of printed text with a very small markup, you enough money to be self-sustaining, so long as there was some mode of courtesy that could, they had to have markets with some sort of regulation. You'll notice they reprinted here, I write about this a lot in my book, they retitle it Notes on America because they want to undo Dickens' pun. It was called American Notes for General Circulation, which was a pun on the fraudulence of American currency in general. Dickens was really attacking the reprinters in this volume as he's describing his American tour. So they republish it as Notes on America. I've given you an example of an American, the New periodical, reprinting all of the Edinburgh magazine. And here, if you get a close-up on the masthead, this to me is a lovely mix of pride in political independence joined with provincial dependence. The masthead says, no pent-up, it's actually from an epilogue to the play Cato. No pent-up Utica constricts our powers, for the whole boundless continent is ours. You know, taking on Columbus as the figure for American westward expansion. And what do they do in this magazine? This great Western-looking reprint vehicle. They reprint the Blackwoods reprint of Blackwoods printing of a British translation of Schiller's Poems and Ballads, right? So this gives you the sense of the shuttles, the reprinting shuttles through which culture is circulated. Here, this is an example, sorry for the bad copy. This is the table of contents of a very popular eclectic magazine made up entirely of reprinted work. A couple of things to notice here, where the author's name should be, you have the name of the journal of origin. British periodicals were often anonymous, but that was gentlemanly anonymity. You knew, if you were an insider, who published in chambers. The British press was, not surprisingly, divided by sectarian and political identity, but in the U.S. it's all jumbled together, and so you have the journal of origin. I picked this one. So you can see under poetry, you've got The Raven. This is a vehicle that reprints American works that were first published in periodicals, not subject to copyright, as well as British works. And what else is interesting in here? Oh, I can't go through it all. But, The Waif, number 16, that's a Longfellow poem. This is also a typical, or it's atypical because it's posed The Raven, but a not surprising kind of headnote where you can see the embedded or the nested nature of reprint culture and the transatlantic circuits of reprinting. So this is the Littell's reprinting of The Raven, the one I just showed you in the table of contents, which has a headnote. We copy the following poem from the American Review, American Whig Review, on account of its unusual beauty. Mr. Willis copies it into the Mirror, that was a weekly paper. The American Whig Review was a monthly, more upmarket volume. But Willis copies it into the Mirror with the following remarks, which are themselves reprinted from the London Critic. In our opinion, it is the most effective single example of fugitive poetry ever published in this country, and unsurpassed in English poetry for subtle conception, etc. It is one of those dainties bred in a book which we feed on. It will stick to the memories of everybody who reads it. So the provincial recirculation of British praise, and also the multiple print contexts. This is the third. There are 4 print contexts that you have here, right? The American Whig Review, the Weekly Mirror, the London Critic, and then the Littell's aggregating magazine. Here, just to mention by the by, there's been some really interesting work done on the African American press, Frederick Douglass paper, and its reliance on reprinting. If you think about the African American press as separate from, it was speaking to Northern abolitionists, but it was reprinting Bleak House at the same time everybody else was reprinting Bleak House, including the vicious anti-abolitionist satire on Mrs. Jellyby, right? I mean, how is it possible, right? But the abolitionist print vehicle itself depended on reprinting and the popularity of British novels. Denny Hack is doing a lot of work on this to circulate its abolitionist political message. I thought you'd enjoy this advertisement for Putnam's Monthly, an entirely original periodical. I want you to see that the idea of originality is the anomaly. It's the sales pitch. If you have, and Putnam, unlike Harper's, Putnam's Monthly and Harper's were founded at roughly the same time, and Putnam's idea was he was going to pay his authors, they were going to be all American authors, but he would cultivate his stable of writers, and by circulating this magazine, he was going to create a network of readers for book publication, which was parasitical on the circulation of periodicals. And again, this is to get maybe too detailed, but if you've got a country with scattered city centers up and down the eastern seaboard, developing into the west and the Midwest, printed matter circulates through the mail. Periodicals circulated cheaply through postal laws through the mail. It's harder to get the books out, much easier to circulate periodicals. But the idea was to build, again, to cultivate a readership that way. Finally, actually, I'll wait for this one. I'll let you sit here with the radical idea in 1853 of an entirely original periodical. Okay. Let's see where I am. Well, the American opposition to international copyright was successful in blocking proposed laws and treaties. It was a mobilized political faction, and it was very successful. Treaties and bills kept getting raised before Congress and not passing. This opposition did not prevent the consolidation of publishers' power, and here I'll really refer you to our 2 talks we'll have on trade courtesy, which is an example of this de facto copyright known as courtesy of the trade, in which a newspaper announcement of the intent to publish informally carried the weight of a property claim, and there were campaigns of retaliation. Our other 2 speakers, Mike and Bob, are doing a better job of describing this than I will. I will say, want to mention, because it's important, I think, to thinking about gentlemanliness, that American publishers secured informal rights in foreign texts by advertising their association with a particular author, but also by voluntarily sending payments to foreign authors or their publishers to establish goodwill, to secure competitive advantage, but also for the right to produce and advertise authorized editions. And I think there's more than a whiff of gentlemanly condescension about these arrangements. The American reprint publisher didn't remunerate the author or publisher for the right to reprint the text. Rather, he bestowed a gratuity to thank him for his services. And you can imagine that a lot of British authors did not take kindly to this. And I'll give you some visual evidence of this. Although such payments could be considerable, they seem designed to keep reprinting from being recognized as subject to contractual relations, and to keep intellectual property, at least across national borders, from being understood as private property. Such extra-legal trade courtesy arrangements continued to regulate the reprint trade throughout the period, despite the fact that they were unenforceable at law. And Sheldon versus Houghton is the legal case that says it's property, lots of money's at stake, but it's unenforceable at law. So here, as my favorite image of I was thinking about Mike's work and wanted to give you an image of what national copying looks like, and the gentlemanly posture of national copying. And here, I'm just pointing you to the Pioneer, which you can imagine is a literary nationalist publication that's publishing Poe and Hawthorne. It reprints in March of 1843, about a year, a little less than a year after American Notes for General Circulation, the Dickens travel narrative, has been published. It publishes this illustration, which has gotten up for this edition of the Pioneer, this upmarket literary journal. And I'm fascinated by it as a representation of democratic gentility in the face of British authorial condescension. What you have here is, it's an episode from the end of the Dickens narrative where he tries to get, his shoes are wearing through, and he tries to get an American cobbler, a tradesman, to make him a new pair of shoes. And from Dickens' perspective, it's this comic of the aristocratic pretensions of the American tradesman. So this illustration is a rebuttal to that, and I'll read you a little bit of the Dickens text so you can read this image along with me. The American tradesman comes in and doesn't take his hat off initially, which really offends Dickens. You know, he should be subservient, and he's making fun of his narcissism. He goes to the mirror to look at himself, and finally then he turns to Dickens, who's got his foot up, to get measured for a new shoe, a new boot. He says, all this time, admiring himself in the mirror, my leg and foot were in the air. Nearly ready, sir? I inquired. Well, pretty nigh, he said. Keep steady. This is Dickens, I kept as steady as I could, both in foot and face. Having by this time got the dust out, found his pencil case, the artist in boots, he calls them, measured me and made the necessary notes. When he had finished, he fell into his old attitude, and taking up the boot again, mused for some time. And this, he said, at last, is an English boot, is it? This is a London boot, eh? That, sir, I replied, is a London boot. He mused over it again after the manner of Hamlet with Yorick's skull, nodded his head as who should say, I pity the institutions that led to the production of this boot. Rose, put up his pencil notes and paper, glanced at himself at the glass all the time, put on his hat, drew on his gloves, and finally walked out. I pity the institutions that manufactured this boot. He's copying the boot. Dickens is asking him to copy the boot, and he's doing it in a gentlemanly way. And I want to say this is the old chant of our marching in the streets. This is what democracy looks like, right? Or this is what a reprinter's idea of democracy looks like, which is gentlemanly postures are available to tradesmen who are reprinting and copying, but critiquing the tradesmen. A lot of the opposition to international copyright, the vocal opposition was the nascent typographers' unions, and they were organized. They're responsible for the shape of the manufacturing clause in the Chase Act. The passage of international copyright that specifies that any reprinted, when you finally get international copyright, reprinted texts have to be set from typeset or plates made in the United States, right? It was a labor position, organized labor. And so this I think, for me, I love this too. If you look at what's behind Dickens and framing his head, these are two shots of Niagara. And if you think about it, that's both the American claim to New World grandeur over and against the decadence of Europe, natural power, but it's also the border between Britain and the U.S., right? It's the Canadian side, which is the British North America, and the U.S. side, framing either side. Anyway, we could spend forever on this image, and I won't. I'll move on quickly. Okay. Let me jump to the theatrical edition. I'll point to this really quickly just to say, because this goes to the development of niche markets we were talking about, Chris and Cal, that authors, aside from trade courtesy, publishers developed a number of strategies for staking out and protecting property in texts that were unprotected by copyright. Authorized editions, for instance, those that are complete with elaborate frontispiece portraits and facsimile signatures, became a popular way for reprint publishers to distinguish their editions from those of rivals. And other publishers, here T.B. Peterson is a good example, they attempted to discourage competitors by saturating the market with editions at every conceivable price point. So T.B. Peters offers 13 different editions, octavo editions of Dickens' works, bound in 7 different styles, 2 different illustrated editions, and what I love, my favorite one, the People's Duodecimo. Right? It's available in 8 different binding styles, ranging from $9 to $75 for a complete set. So that's a real attempt to grab the market for collected Dickens. And these are I would call these American books. They are part of American publishers' idea of what small R Republican circulation would look like. I should just note that reprint culture also conferred a new kind of value on illustrations, because type could be easily reset. Engravings were more difficult and expensive to reproduce. Some publishers secured property in their texts by investing heavily in ornamental plates, a practice that Hugh Amory has called proprietary illustration. Right? You take a text that can be reset, but you invest your capital in the illustrations and get people to buy your book. And one good example. This is Dickens coming in here, and this is an authorized edition. I'll blow by this, but a good example is the Harper's Illuminated New Pictorial Bible, which included 1,600 illustrations, woodcut illustrations. And of course, the Bible is the classic example of the work open to all reprinters. At least in the U.S., you had Bible patents in England, and these were distributed like a periodical through the mail in installments with these illustrations. Okay. I'll just say really quick, I'm sorry I'm going over time, that authors and publishers sought to overcome or leverage the territoriality of copyright law, 19th century copyright law, either closing the gap between national copyright systems or figuring out ways to exploit the uneven global distribution of IP rights. American authors were able to acquire a de facto international copyright by carefully coordinating the publication of their work at home and abroad. Until the mid-19th century, it was widely assumed that prior or simultaneous publication of an American work in Great Britain would be enough to confer British copyright. So when the House of Lords determined in 1854 that a foreign author needed to travel to Britain to claim copyright protection, this ruling produced a wave of British reprints of popular American works where authors didn't travel to London, but also a number of strategically timed trips to London by American authors so they could claim British copyright in newly published works. And after 1868, the House of Lords rephrases that to mean foreign authors residing in British dominions, so American authors just go to Canada. That's why that picture of Niagara so interesting to me. So finally, I'm going to turn to the playwright. I'll try to do this quickly. Samuel French is my figure here, whose firm's green paperback acting editions of classic plays will be familiar to many of you from high school theatricals. He was particularly adept at turning the differences between and among national copyright systems to his advantage, French, British, and American. French struggled to make a living in New York, printing play texts for American regional theaters, until he joined forces in the 1870s with British publisher Thomas Lacey, who made most of his money publishing plays and renting costumes for aristocrats' private theatricals. From his expatriate's perch in London, French was able to hire a stable of English writers to translate popular French melodramas, texts that were unprotected by copyright in Great Britain, and then to control the circulation of these translations in both Britain and the US by virtue of his residency and his citizenship. He was clever. He perched himself right where he could control both markets. French made his money from selling printed play texts to regional American theaters, not from collecting royalties for performance, which at least in the US proved unenforceable. Both Great Britain and the US had established performance rights in dramatic compositions by the mid-19th century, but they established consequentially different means for claiming these rights. The 1842 British law assimilated performance to the model of print, taking the first public representation of a play to be the equivalent of publication. Hewing to territorial limits, the law required that a play be staged in Great Britain in order for performance rights to be conveyed. However, the great profits to be made by British companies touring in the US placed the British playwright in considerable jeopardy, since even an unauthorized American production was taken by British courts to constitute publication and could cause the loss of copyright in Great Britain. And yet printing plays in Great Britain, which secured British copyright, left them completely open to American piracy. That's a double bind that British playwrights are stuck in. As John Russell Stevens concisely summarizes the situation, to publish in America was to be deprived of British copyright, to publish in Britain was effectively to lose all rights in America. As a result of this transatlantic conundrum, British theater companies took to staging copyright performances in provincial theaters. They tried to advertise them so nobody would come, because the plays were kind of raw. They were going to try them out in the US, see if they were successful, bring them back, and then premiere in London. So they have a reading, often with a single actor reading all the parts in a provincial theater, so as to claim British copyright before taking off for their American tours. In the United States, the 1856 revision of the copyright law that allowed for the extension of performance rights to dramatic authors turned out to be utterly ineffective without corresponding changes in the business and culture of American theater. Playwrights George Henry Boker and Dion Boucicault were behind the successful campaign for a dramatic authors bill in '56. Boker, in particular, longed to publish a representative edition of his writing without, by dint of publication, effectively surrendering future royalty payments for permission to stage his plays. So the bill easily cleared the House and the Senate. Boker published his plays and poems in '56, but the passage of the law failed to bring about the kinds of changes in theatrical practice that would allow playwrights to exert control of their work through publication. Fierce competition for audiences, the piracy of dramatic text through oral transcription, and the turnover of plays and repertory theater all worked to defeat copyright registration rules that were designed for texts that were untied to performances. The Act of 1856 required the title page of a work to be registered before publication or performance, and it required the script to be deposited within 3 months. As one critic explains, since most pirated versions of a play were brought out within a few days of the original being performed, it was very difficult to prove infringement. Furthermore, the remedy for infringement provided by the Act was costly and unwieldy, and most playwrights simply couldn't be bothered to use it. I think the structure of the theater is more important than the failures of the writing of the law or its remedies. The general dependence of mid-century American theater on touring stars meant that property lodged not with a play, nor with a playwright, but rather with a performer. Despite the addition of performance rights to the copyright law, playwrights continued to depend on individual performers for remuneration, either leaving their plays unpublished and receiving payments directly from actors, or accepting the proceeds from third-night benefit performances, which is how playwrights got paid. And so the law gets passed and none of that changes. Although printed plays were convenient for rehearsals and valuable stock for a theater company, playwrights and theater managers also desired to protect their property from rivals and knew they could maintain perpetual rights in unprinted works under the common law. So one solution to this dilemma was to print the text of a play. I love this slide. Oops, sorry, that's the one I love. To print the text of a play as an acting edition, but to claim on the title page that the work was printed but not published. Right? Which is to say, it's valuable, that holds property right, because it falls outside of the statutory copyright system, right? It's printed but not published. We don't have a category for that. Okay, I think I've gone over time, so I should just quickly say what I understand changes this situation of the law being passed, but theater culture carrying on just as it were, with theater owners, managers, and playwrights keeping their play texts either in handwritten form or printed but not published, and not taking advantage of the law that's there. In the late 1870s, actors' contracts get renegotiated. We shift from a repertory situation where the actors have lines of business. They do second lady business or drunken Irishman business, and they get a new play every 3 days. All the actors' contracts have to be renegotiated so that they're willing to and are paid for playing a specific part through the length of the run. Laura Keene invents folding stage scenery that can be put on trains and travel between regional theaters, right? And coordinates payments to all these regional houses to put on their play so that traveling theater troupes produce extended runs of plays. At that point, it becomes valuable for playwrights to try to preserve copyright in their printed plays, right? The long-term success of a single play looks like it could be profitable to protect. So then publishers can profit from direct control over the published text. My last slide here was simply to suggest that for literary critics, I think what we need to do is not to look to treatises like Drone's treatise as benchmarks for the standardization of legal concepts, but actually to read across the grain of these legal treatises to recover the practices that were beginning to break down and cause norm-directed practices to enter the field of law. And here, these are just a couple of cases on what's called the memory doctrine, the idea that you could legitimately reproduce a play if you held all the parts in your memory, that it was only transcription that was breaking the law. Literal copying was against the law, but holding the parts in of the play in your mind and then restaging a rival production of the same play was not infringing. It drove Eaton Drone crazy, the memory doctrine, and yet there are a bunch of lovely cases that really suggest how complicated the circulation of property in plays were. And I'll just read these and yield the floor here. I want you just to think about how complicated the circulation of property was and who and how it was protected. So in V. Wheatley, this suit was brought by Miss Laura Keene for the alleged invasion of her rights in Our American Cousin. She had brought the manuscript of this comedy from its author, Tom Taylor, who's British. After making in it material alterations, including additions suggested by Joseph Jefferson, an actor employed by her, she entered the title for copyright under the statute of the United States, but did not publish the play in print. It was first publicly performed at her theater in 1858. Soon after, it's brought out in Philadelphia by the defendants, who were in possession of a copy of the original manuscript, which had been surreptitiously obtained in London, where the comedy had not then been performed. So we've got various forms of restraint and circulation, non-printing but copyright claiming, immensely complicated. Or Crowe v. Aiken, brought in 1869 by the husband of the actress, well known as Miss Kate Bateman, a touring star, to restrain the unlicensed playing of the drama Mary Warner, the manuscript of which Mrs. Crowe had bought from the same Tom Taylor, first brought out by her in London, and in the following autumn in New York, but there's no authorized publication in print, the defendant having, as he alleged, got a printed copy from a New York publisher of dramas who announced the play for performance at his theater in Chicago, right? London, Chicago, New York. Circulation of manuscripts, various forms of restraint and the violation of those norms. I'm going to let it go because I've gone over. I want to make sure we have time for Bob, but thank you for hanging with me.
Oh, can you pass on that knowledge?
I'm afraid I'm not a
Let's see.
Windows user. Yeah.
I just do. Well, I want to thank you both for being such great predecessors. I mean, the issues you've explored are extremely interesting and rich, and I hope I can just pull together some thoughts about trade courtesy, many of which have already been sounded or sampled in those previous talks. I think Meredith began to sketch. Both of you touched on really the origins of much of the free foreign material in the United States, and the origins were in the statute. The 1790 U.S. copyright statute intentionally withheld and expressly withheld copyright from foreign authors, and for a full century after that time, foreign authors had little and mostly no copyright protection in the States. They had a couple of strategies that were sometimes but rarely used. You could become a resident, a foreign resident of the United States, and if you did that, you would enjoy copyright in your productions, but you had to establish that permanent intention to be a resident, and that was very difficult because nobody wanted to uproot that way. You could also occasionally collaborate with an American author, get your name on the title page, or get rather the American author's name on the title page. The American author would take out the copyright. You would be a sort of residual beneficiary of that. But those were, again, you can see how narrow and almost impossible in many cases to satisfy. There are some examples, but they're not numerous. So trade courtesy it came in as a way of regulating ruinous competition for very, very popular foreign titles, and as a way, I nod to Mike here, as a way of giving otherwise suspect businessmen an aura of respectability and fairness. And the major publishers in New York, Philadelphia, and Boston were participants and practitioners and pioneers of trade courtesy. One of the things Meredith mentioned, the manufacturing clause, came into the law for the very first time in 1891 in the U.S. Chase Copyright Act. This was the first time, at least formally, foreign authors were given an opportunity to capture an American copyright, but they had to make sure that their works were set from type manufactured in the States or plates manufactured on U.S. soil, and there was really a de facto requirement of simultaneous or first publication in the United States. Imagine how difficult. And then the manufacturing clause was not only carried on, but in fact in some ways amplified in the 1909 Act, because in that Act, although it extended grace, that is copyright protection, for all foreign language books published abroad, all you had to do was comply with the other formalities of U.S. copyright notice, deposit, and such. But it maintained the manufacturing requirements for all English language books published abroad, and in fact expanded the manufacturing requirements from typesetting, plate making, to printing and binding. So in other words, this is a protectionist giveaway to very clamoring trades in the book manufacturing sector. And that was an argument that kept the manufacturing clause in place for essentially effectively until the 1950s and residually until the 1980s before it finally sunsetted. So who are our victims? Many. We've already talked about, if we call them victims, we've talked about many of them already, but of course one of the most vociferous of them was Charles Dickens, who actually during tours, lecture tours to the United States, which were otherwise triumphant and triumphal, he brought quite a bit of criticism upon himself by criticizing the piracies in the United States. Many Americans thought, my goodness, look, this rich British author comes here and gets all these receipts for his lectures and so forth, and now he's complaining about the spread of literacy and the spread of reading in the United States. That's part of Meredith's work on, I think, the Republican sentiment of spreading knowledge through essentially lawful piracy. Courtesy had what I think of it as having a horizontal and a vertical axis. By requiring participating publishers to respect the claim of the first to publish or the first to announce, I like Bob Ellickson's term, the first pirate right. I think it's a terrific phrase, the first pirate right. It regulated competition among publishers horizontally, cartel-like in many ways. And I think there was some real monopolistic tendencies to trade courtesy. And fended off destructive competition for the new foreign work. But vertically, it organized and ordered relations between American publishers and their resource materials, that is, foreign authors and their publishers. At least that vertical relationship, and of course there was a vast relationship with purchasers and readers. Courtesy was an unwritten law. It had many names. Mike gave some of them. And it played this very, very interesting role of regulation and, I suppose, in some ways, appeasement of the authors and publishers abroad. We know now, by the end or towards the end of this conference, that scholars have been exploring informal norms-based rules in many contexts. We have some of the central figures here at this conference. And discovering how these informal rules can conserve common resources and regulate professional and individual behavior, and how these have succeeded in small, cohesive groups. Notable examples of such norms: the Maine lobstermen, who have a bunch of rules for regulating restraining the depletion of lobsters in otherwise non-law regulated contexts. The informal rules that are observed in the cotton industry, in the diamond trade. We've talked about norms for chef's recipes, for stand-up comedy and fashion designs. Those have been fascinatingly explored by Cal and Chris in their work and their book. It is, trade courtesy, a fascinating, to me, very fascinating example of Bob Ellickson's order without law, a system of workaday rules and norms peculiar to a close-knit group. Remember, the courtesy publishers are a fairly small number. The estimates vary between 9 and maybe 15 over time. Major publishers who play this game recognize each other's participation in the game and vociferously complain about those who don't play the game. Sometimes the main players, but many times the deviant upstarts who come and nibble at the edges of courtesy, gain their own foothold by reprinting and generating a list, and they either do or do not eventually join the courtesy game. They may remain deviants. They may, like Harper's, spend a whole illustrious career being sometimes a courteous publisher and sometimes a discourteous pirate, depending on opportunities. A very opportunistic publisher, Harper's. One thing that I think is quite interesting about courtesy is that a number of the communities that we've talked about in the last couple days actually exercise some choice between formal and informal rules. That is, a more or less constrained choice, a more or less transaction cost burden choice, which may have tilted it one way or another. But they were able to exercise a choice about whether to adopt informal rules or to go with the rules, the laws, the regulations that exist. Bob Ellickson's cattle owners and landowners had access to tort laws, trespass laws, actually regulations involved in building fences, maintaining fences, but they opted with more or less consciousness for the informal rules, the defaults that they had generated and lived with for so long. That seemed to be more efficient for them. And there are other examples of this kind of thing. What Lisa Bernstein does is often show how there are, private contracts exist between merchants in the cotton industry, and yet those private contracts themselves, a kind of private law, are departed from by norms that lie atop the contractual relationship. So there are all kinds of waivers and all kinds of other normative behaviors that exist in the same orbit as the formal rules. But there are communities that really didn't have much of a choice. We've already talked a little bit about that. Cal and Chris did. Stand-up comedy, very thin protection and very hard to really enforce under copyright laws, similar for chefs, recipes, and fashion designs. These are sort of protection gaps. Chris and Cal call them negative spaces, IPs, negative spaces. And trade courtesy was certainly a place where there was an enormous negative space when we think of the foreign authors who were unprotected alongside their protected, or at least potentially protectable American cousins. Although Meredith has also complicated that picture to show about how, for example, periodical publishing of something as noteworthy as The Raven could lack copyright and could then become another resource for reprinting. So that picture is not completely foreign versus American. It has its exceptions. So I think of courtesy as something that is situated alongside law. It's a kind of order alongside law. It exists in a kind of conscious emulation of law in certain ways, and what it did in many ways was to reconstitute the rules of copyright within a courtesy space. It mimicked the copyright law. So in addition to copying foreign authors' works, it also copied the Copyright Act in a sense. It imitated those rules. The foundational rules of courtesy were unusual. Instead of presupposing or conferring a property regime, federal law created a vast intangible commons of foreign creativity, entitling anyone to make free use of an abundance of public goods. Turning this creative commons into informal exclusive rights was the foundational work of cooperating courtesy publishers who laid down the ground rules that enabled the exchange of these synthetic rights and the sale and distribution of courtesy-protected foreign books. In other words, what you might think of as an exceptionalist law gave rise to an exceptional informal code. An unusual feature of trade courtesy is that it did not serve, directly anyway, as a mechanism for incentivizing the creation of authorial works. And here I think of the distinction that that Cal and Chris were making between production and distribution, a very, very important distinction in the context of innovation here, reprinting. Trade courtesy did not incentivize the creation of foreign authorial works. That was incentivized if, indeed, the theory of rational incentives provided by copyright laws is true. These works were incentivized by the foreign copyright laws that they did enjoy, the protections they did enjoy in their own or other countries abroad. It was not incentivized, at least not directly, by the American context. Trade courtesy was then a way to incentivize distribution and circulation rather than production. Trade courtesy was a market-saving answer not to the creation of these works, but their publication and distribution. Those activities that were subject to unrestrained free writing by American publishers was the target, a tragic overuse of a common pool of free public goods. So in its simplest outlines, courtesy granted an informal exclusive right of publication to the first American publisher to announce plans, the first pirate right, announce plans to issue an uncopyrighted foreign work. Participating houses recognized this right and refrained from printing on or publishing on, as the phrase was, the announcing firm. In practice, though, the bare announcement was often coupled with with something else, often a contract or an arrangement, as it was called, made with the foreign author or the foreign publisher, the purchase of advance sheets or proofs, that is to say, before the work actually appeared in Britain, the acquisition with a lot of very fascinating racing of boats and things and couriers to obtain those advance sheets to get a bare 24, 48 hours, sometimes march on the other pirates, which actually leads to an interesting question of whether trade courtesy is clearly relevant to the property right, the absent property right in the work, but actually there seem to be a lot of contracts that were being made around here, and I think that Mike's work on looking at these written contracts is very interesting because in some ways you could say that what was happening, particularly with advance sheets, is that there was a contract for sale of goods, not a contractual relationship vis-a-vis the intangible property right in the work, but rather they were acquiring advance sheets as a sort of tangible goods. The benefit for that, the contractual benefit for the American purchaser of the sheets, was something like a 24, 48, maybe slightly more first mover advantage, somewhat like what Cal and Chris write about in the fashion industry, a first mover advantage that would give them an opportunity to reap profits in that very short period before their exclusivity was eroded by a lot of pirating. So advance sheets. The courtesy entitlements included obtaining, especially over time, a prior association with the author. If you published an author once and had some kind of courtesy relationship, you would claim a right to be able to continue that author's publications, to associate. This is really an option system. What we would think of as an option system in publishing contracts today. There was also a very interesting variation on this theme, and that is when you didn't have an association, and if you didn't have actually an agreement or arrangement with an author, but this author might be a new author or an untried author or an author who had not caught on anywhere, you could obtain a courtesy entitlement by being the first to experiment, by the first to take a risk on that author, which is, I think, a very Lockean concept. You know, you are the first to labor in that particular commons, and this experiment is then recognized. Now, if the experiment doesn't work, they didn't have to pay the author. If the experiment did work, the norm was to pay the author something, but then also be able to expect an association with that author in the future. So these I'm fascinated by this taxonomy. This is part of what I wanted to write about in Without Copyrights is the kind of unfolding taxonomy that existed for these folks. Then we say ex gratia payments. The payment system needs to be refined in our research. I've just already suggested that maybe these actually were contractual arrangements. There was actual payment consideration being made for a tangible good being sent across the waters. Maybe other things like, for example, the authorized letter. I'm actually going to give a talk, I think, in Toronto in sometime this winter, which will be focused on these author statements. These are published in De Quincey's volumes, in Darwin volumes, reprinted in the States, and and this continues into the 20s and 30s, 1920s and 30s, of the author letter. The handwriting is often reproduced as photo engraving, and it is an author stating at a minimum that this is my authorized publisher, and I thank that author, that publisher. There's often a lot of gratitude being expressed. De Quincey even says, Thomas De Quincey in various reprinted authorization letters says, I know I don't have any legal rights, but I'm grateful to my publisher for being such a moral publisher and helping me to financial advantage. So whether these are ex gratia or whether there was a contract there, some of them certainly were. They were after the fact honoraria that were kind of thrown at the grateful, some mostly grateful author, but that the whole issue of payments, I think, needs more research. Punishments were very interesting. There's a whole menu of punishments for the deviants. Of course, you can't really punish the outside deviant, the adventitious pirate, the pirate that comes in and opens up shop and has never been a courtesy participant in the first place. We're talking about close-knit communities, but you can punish those who are part of the game, and those punishments were escalating punishments, private objection or protest. I think Mike had a couple of images of letters in which one publisher protests to another publisher. That could be anything from mild and urbane to savage in the protest. Communal shaming. This is Bob Ellickson's truthful negative gossip, which I love the fact that Bob, has shown us that gossip can have all kinds of effects. It can be a highly complimentary gossip. It can have those benefits, but it can also be a punishing sort of gossip, especially if it's truthful in these contexts. If it's not truthful, it might be a slander or something, but it is truthful negative gossip in the courtesy context helped tame these folks. Ostracism, too, refusals to deal, cartel-like behavior that might exclude somebody from certain benefits. Then predatory pricing. This was very often used if one of the non-courtesy pirates published a cheap edition, or one of the courtesy publishers publishes a cheaper edition, prints on a courtesy publisher, then the original entitled courtesy publisher might reissue that book at a lower rate, and then there's a price war. It drives it right down, sometimes to ruinous competition. But some of these publishers said, I will put up with the ruination because we need to teach them a lesson. So there were actual sacrifices of interest to uphold the courtesy system. And then finally, outright retaliation. You just print on somebody. If they print on you, then you take one of their titles and you print on them. A very dangerous proceeding, and it was actually recognized as quite an extreme proceeding, because if you did that, you were really going back to the state of nature. You were really courting Hobbes's poor, nasty, brutish, and short existence, which courtesy had come to stave off. Different meanings of pirate. This is fascinating to me. The discourse of piracy. I'm actually teaching a course this spring, an undergraduate course here at University of Tulsa called Piracy. It's actually subtitled Steal This Course. And it will really be about the discourse of piracy. We'll start with maritime piracy. We'll read Treasure Island. We'll read other accounts of piracy. And we'll see why that label becomes so firmly fixed in the 19th century, early 19th century, for literary and intellectual property piracy, and why it continues today in the internet. It is a very persistent label. In a way, you would think, knowing what piracy can be off the Somali coast and so forth, even today, knowing what maritime piracy can be, it seems like hyperbolic. I mean, it seems like Jack Valente's description of the VCR as the Boston Strangler. These sort of extreme terms occur for those who would try to control completely a public good. So, for the foreign author and publisher world, all American publishers were really pirates. They were pirates because they existed under a piratical law, and in simply so existing, they were pirates. But also, piracy took on a name with the piracy trade, a shaming name that the deviant, and if you exhibited deviant behavior, you were a pirate in this second order of piracy. You were now a deviant from the norms of courtesy. So these two pirate terms, these two kinds of piracy, really alluded to two public domains in a way. You had the legal public domain in the United States, and then you had the ethical public domain that courtesy had created. And what is very fascinating is that there are examples of courtesy breaking down, so that a title that had been owned, say Tennyson's poems by a Boston publisher, recognized as a courtesy title within the normative context in the United States, suddenly gets printed on. For whatever reason, there may be a retaliation, there might be a slippage of some sort, and you have a bunch of piling on, everybody's publishing it. And now that title is recognized and described by courtesy publishers as a public domain text. So we have a kind of second death of copyright. Within the courtesy context, it is recognized that it's fallen back into a public domain that it had been pulled out of by the courtesy norms. Victims of more slightly later piracy in the United States. Piracy continues. Don't think that the 1891 and 1909 acts eliminated lawful piracy. As we say, the manufacturing clause was onerous, difficult to satisfy. Let me give you an example of courtesy that continues into the 20th century. This is 1925, well after 1891, well after the 1909 Act. We have a novel by W.H. Hudson called Green Mansions, very popular. It had been in the Alfred Knopf Modern Library. You're all familiar with the Modern Library. And he had published that book, or he believed anyway that he had a right to publish that book. When Bennett Cerf and his partner in 1925 purchased the Modern Library, and a very momentous thing that was, think of the Modern Library under Random House and what it became in terms of a library. The two of these young men, having purchased the Modern Library, went to Alfred Knopf and said, we've done this. And he said, well, you've got Green Mansions in that thing. It was acquired by Horace Liveright before then. And Knopf says, that upsets me. And Cerf says, I didn't know that, sir. And Knopf says, well, what are you going to do about it? In the shadow of no law, I proposed then that we pay him a royalty on Green Mansions of 6 cents a copy. He acknowledged that he thought it was very fair, since legally he had no case. I left him with my admiration unimpaired, and I think he thought we were pretty decent kids. This is pure courtesy, and it's going on in 1925. This continues, and much of the book aspects of the book that I published recently is about, in fact, the persistence and the survival of courtesy in sotto voce, sub rosa type ways. After all, we have the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. We do have the Chase Act. We also have the rise in the 1880s and 90s of literary agents. And literary agents whittle down cartels, especially those based on simply normative behavior, pretty clearly. The publishers hated the agents. People like Holt and Putnam and others just railed against agents as destroying this avuncular relationship between publishers and their authors. Samuel Roth, I'll just end with a couple of remarks about Sam Roth. He has recently, he's become an interesting figure. He's actually a pirate pornographer, and the mugshot here is not for having reprinted on anybody, but it was for his pornographic publications. This included Ulysses, D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover, and things that we think of now as important works. But he was being often arrested and sometimes jailed for them well into his 60s. He was pirated all kinds. These are all lawful piracies, but it goes on and on with a cast of illustrious authors, and his sources in Europe are many, and he is the rational pirate of all time, not observing the courtesy codes in any orderly way. Sometimes a little bit, often not. But what he does is he deeply researches things. He's aware of what's coming out, what has just come out in Britain or other places. He researches copyright office records and things, and what he does. In fact, I think he was sued, as far as I can tell, only once for copyright infringement, and that was kind of a trivial, marginal case. Had nothing to do with his main activities. I will simply end by saying courtesy really goes in well on into the 1960s as some sort of presence in American publishing. There are those in the room who may remember the Tolkien craze of the 60s and 70s, where all of a sudden you could obtain, the 3-volume work or The Hobbit at these in these paperback editions. They were Ballantine editions, but the Ballantine paperbacks were responses to an Ace publication, which was a lawful piracy, a discourteous publication where the rising tide of popularity for Tolkien was captured by Ace. And Tolkien said, well, and his publisher said, we got to do something, because he was currently being printed in hardback, rather expensive. And the Ballantine paperbacks were the response. And take a look at what's on the back of those volumes. This paperback edition and no other has been published with my consent and cooperation. Those who approve of courtesy, at least, to living authors, will purchase it and no other. Courtesy continues as a strong current and cited by the creator of Middle Earth, even into the 60s and 70s. Thank you very much.